All right. Hello everyone. I'm Mohamed Habib. I used to be a software engineer at Amazon in the Prime Video team, and currently I'm launching a new startup. So I'm the CTO of Digger.dev. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but we are the fastest way for you to deploy on AWS. Great. So today we're going to talk about deploying to the cloud, which is I'm gonna give you a brief history about deployments, how we got to this thing that we call the cloud today, and talk about if you were to launch your app, your Node.js app, your Express app, your Python app with a front end, what are the options available to you, how you can choose which options. So I'm gonna lay down a framework to help you choose where to deploy, and yeah, hopefully it will help you in your future exciting products which you're building. So before I start, I'm going to start with a bit of history. We're going to go back to a while ago, something like the 70s, where we had this thing called Turbo Pascal. Well, I wasn't born then, so I've never actually used Turbo Pascal, but those who have used it told me how exciting it was because it allowed you to build anything, any kind of software for the enterprise. So essentially, Turbo Pascal allowed anyone with a single pair of hands to build enterprise software and sell it. So this is a remarkable fact because nowadays I don't even think this is possible for a single pair of hands to build enterprise software. About 10 years later, the internet started arriving, started becoming more mainstream. And as a result of the exciting arrival of the internet, we started building client-server apps. And with virtualization, which meant that you could essentially have a bunch of hardware stacks and have a hypervisor move around these VMs around, it meant that we could rent hardware. So companies with data centers could have these hypervisors on them, and they could rent OS hardware to us, which was all virtualized. So resources were available on demand. And as a result, we started building client-server apps. For those of you who are not familiar with this is the cPanel, which is obviously an old tool allowing us to manage Linux servers. It was quite popular back in the days before the major cloud providers and PaaS jumped on here. It allowed us to do the essential Linux tasks. Okay, so since there was a huge opportunity, because everyone wanted to build these client-server apps and deploy them, there was a huge opportunity, and obviously the tech giants wanted to leverage this opportunity. So you've got these big four tech companies that started building their respective cloud providers, started offering services. And so the problem, though, is that they started getting a bit too complex. So in this video, we have a song about the 168 services sung in 2 minutes. Actually, right now, I think they are even over 170. So in the current state of things, to deploy something to AWS, you usually have to do more than think about your app. You usually have to think about load balancers, security groups, networking, configurations, and so on and so forth. And because it was quite hard to work with AWS, it was quite involved. There was a lot of configurations. We saw that a lot of simplification layers started to evolve as well. So Heroku, as a start, was released about 2 to 3 years after AWS came. And soon after, we saw quite a few things, notably things like Firebase, Netlify, Vercel, serverless. All of them are platform as a services arriving to help you deploy your apps in a with kind of less configurations. So they manage all the complexity behind the scenes, and you just rely on them to deploy. So in the next few slides, I'm going to share with you a framework which I use to kind of decide which platform as a service I would use. So given that I decided I don't want to use AWS, I'm building some cool new product. How do I decide now whether to choose Heroku or Firebase or Vercel or Data? So I'm going to lay the advantages and disadvantages of each, and hopefully it will help you in this decision-making process, because choice can be overwhelming sometimes. So before we actually get into all of the gritty details of the platform as a service platforms, let's agree, both of us, on what we mean by a modern web app. So in my mind, 95% of modern web apps contain these components. So we have a server that could be serving an API. We have a web app, which is your React or vue.js front end. We have a background worker, which would process all of your background jobs, like sending emails or any asynchronous type of work. And then at the infrastructure side, we have your email or SMS type service, which sends emails to your users. You have your file store, which is something like an S3 object storage to store your user data or files. You have a database to store your application state. And then you have a queue, which is your broker between your server and your backend worker. So once we agree this definition, we can then go ahead and talk about all of the platform as a service and see how they enable us to build an application like this. So let's get started. So Heroku was one of the first platforms as a service to arrive. It was mainly focused on Rails, Ruby on Rails, to allow you to deploy apps easily. And in my view, it's quite easy to use if you already have. Sorry, the audio was just playing there. If you already have an existing Django or Rails or Express app, it's very optimized for these. So if you have a backend and you want to deploy it, it's great. It also gives you one command to, for example, add a database to your application. It exposes the environment variables, and so you use environment variables and you're good to go. One thing to be careful is database lock-in. So once you start using it, if your database grows, then they start charging you, and then you could be paying quite a lot of money. And basically, in a way, you could be stuck unless you decide to move to, for example, a cheaper option like AWS, if your application gets to that level of mainstream. All right, so that's Heroku. Up next is Firebase. So when Firebase started, it was mainly using it was mainly a real-time database. So it offered you a real-time database called Firestore for your apps and the client to talk to this Firestore database. And so essentially, you didn't really need a server, because all your application needed to do, if you had an application which only needed to store some data and fetch data, which is actually a large amount of services, then you could do that. And it was quite hyped with mobile devs specifically, but also it was catered for other use cases as well, like the web. And it offered an actual serverless-like experience. Obviously, when you start using Firebase, you would definitely be locked in, because you would be using the Firebase client throughout your application. And so it would be super hard for you to move to any other cloud provider down the line. So when you choose Firebase, you'd be making a conscious choice that you're in it for a while. It also gets quite expensive once you exceed the the free limit. So one thing, there is an alternative to Firebase, which is Supabase, and it would be interesting because with Supabase, because it's open source, they have a managed version, but if you so wish, you could dump your app and then deploy it to AWS later. So Supabase is something to consider as an alternative to Firebase. They do position themselves as an open source Firebase alternative. All right. Up next, we have quite popular tools of Netlify and Vercel, which are hyper-focused for front-end. So if you have a Vue.js or React app, anything else that's front-end focused, deploying to Netlify and Vercel should be a breeze because their focus is front-end. One common pattern I see is people deploying their front-end to Netlify or Vercel and having a backend API hosted elsewhere like Heroku. And that's a very, very good option because you get the best of both worlds in this case. With Netlify, there is not really much of a lock-in because there is no state to deal with. So you can always move your front end somewhere else if you're not happy. So this is a safe option to consider if you so wish, right? So front end, Netlify/Vercel, backend on Heroku. Okay. We have Render, which positions itself as its own cloud provider. So it gives you web apps, static sites, background workers, APIs, cron jobs, Dockerfile, Postgres, and private services. So Render positions itself as a new cloud provider, kind of head-to-head with AWS and others. Although, as far as I'm aware, they are using AWS/GCP server. But when we asked them, they did mention that they are moving to their own hardware or on-prem. So that would be exciting. Their main selling point is that you can use one YAML file to declare your entire stack. So if your application needs a database or a worker, you define all of this stuff in a YAML file, and then you could have a one-click deploy experience of your app. And they also have quick start of many use cases. So they also have like one-click deploy buttons of some of the popular open source vendors. Like for example, Ghost blogging, you can have a one-click deploy for it to Render, which is quite interesting. So if you want some hosted versions, you can deploy it. But obviously, once on Render, you're locked into Render. So that's what you need to be careful of. But if you're excited by their promise and their simplicity, by all means, you can start using Render. So finally, last but not least, let's talk about Data. So I'm a big fan of Data. It's quite a new project, but I think it's extremely promising. It is optimized for Python, in particular Flask and Fast API, and any Node.js projects. The deployment experience is super smooth. It was trending #1 on Product Hunt when it launched, so there's a lot of promise. It also gives you some really cool things like authentication out of the box, and it gives you access to a key value type database. So pretty much a lot of what you need to get started exists, and so you can do some rapid deployments of a lot of your projects on Data. Now, we've completed all of our platform as a service, but let me tell you about, let's kind of shift the topic and talk about, maybe you realize that there is some problem here. Maybe there is a dilemma in the modern cloud type applications. So the problem is that the tools that we do enjoy using for our hobby projects, like Heroku, serverless, are quite different from the tools that we have to use at work, like AWS and GCP. Because serious businesses usually decide to build on AWS and Google and Azure and similar. Okay. So 3 months ago, me and a friend, we were kind of grabbing some coffee at a bar, and we decided that we really wanted to address this problem, this dilemma. And from this, we decided to build a new tool which allowed you to do both. Get the experience of your favorite tools, but deploy on your own AWS or your own GCP to unlock the potential and bridge this gap. So this tool is called Digger, and it essentially gives you the power of AWS, but the ease of use of Heroku and Netlify. And to get started, all you have to do is initialize a project, connect your AWS account, and boom, you get the URL for your service. So to get started, all you have to do is run npm install, and then run dginit inside one of your service folders. There is also a surprise command called dgph, which I'm not going to share what it does exactly, but I hope you run it and find out for yourself. So this concludes the presentation, and I would be more than happy to take all of your questions.